Immigrant Children in New York City by Lillian Foreman. Imagine a busy street in New York City 100 years ago. Rows of 5- and 6-story brick buildings border the narrow streets. Fire escapes zigzag across the fronts of buildings. No trees grow here. The gutters are filled with muddy water and garbage. Not far from the gutters, a peddler stands with his pushcart. He calls out, asking people to buy his fruits and vegetables. Women gather around his pushcart. They don't complain about being hustled by the peddler. They're used to pushy salespeople. Other shoppers elbow their way through the crowds. A few young children run in and out among the grown-ups playing tag. They are excited to get out of the crowded apartments where they live. The young children do not seem to care that their clothes are shabby and too large. It is enough for them to be outside playing. The older children look serious and busy. One boy, who might be 10 years old, walks along slowly, carrying a pile of overcoats. His clothes are shabby. His eyes are sad. Perhaps he is wishing he could play tag with the younger children. The people who lived in New York City's Lower East Side during the early 1900s were very poor. Many were immigrants who had just arrived from different countries in Europe. Some quickly found homes by living with relatives. Still, the average newcomer had little money and could not speak English. They would have been lost without their relatives who had arrived earlier. Those relatives could give them advice and help them settle in their new country. Many immigrants dreamed of coming to a country where everyone lived in luxury. Unfortunately, they found that New York City was much like their home villages. Wealthy New Yorkers, like the rich of Europe, lived in big mansions. But most immigrants lived in tiny apartments that reminded them of their old homes. The immigrants worked hard to pay the rent and feed their families. Most knew they would never become rich. They hoped, however, that their children would live in comfort, and indeed, some of their children did go on to find better circumstances for themselves, but they often had to endure hardships before their lives improved. America offered immigrants opportunities to better themselves. One way that immigrant children could do this was by getting an education. Most immigrant children wanted to go to school, but things stood in the way. Most immigrant parents were poor. Their children took jobs to help the family. These jobs were usually difficult and dangerous. There were night classes available for children who worked, but most children found it was too hard to stay awake and learn things in class after a long day at work. Employers liked to hire children because they could pay them less than they paid grown-ups. In 1890, the number of factory workers under the age of 15 was 1.5 million. By 1900, the number rose to 1.7 million. Many of these children worked in garment factories where they made clothes. These factories were called sweatshops because they were hot and the bosses made employees work very hard. Children who worked in sweatshops often became sick. Some machines were so dangerous to operate that children got injured when they used them. In 1916, the United States Congress passed a law that stopped children under the age of 14 from working in factories, and children under the age of 16 from working in mines. It also limited a child's working day to 8 hours. However, the United States Supreme Court later overturned this law. Regardless of what the law said, most child laborers worked long hours. Then they came home to crowded apartments that were hot in the summer and cold in the winter. They and their families often had to share these small, uncomfortable spaces with lodgers. The lodgers helped pay the rent in exchange for a place to sleep. Sometimes as many as 12 people slept in one room. Many apartments had only one window. During the summers, everyone slept on the fire escapes and roofs. Sometimes the only running water came from a faucet in the hall. All the people who lived on that floor used it. Despite the hardships they faced, immigrant children found ways to learn and to have fun. Some did attend school, at least for a while. Once they learned to read, they were able to use New York City's public libraries. Immigrant parents wanted their children to be educated. They also wanted them to know their heritage. So they taught them songs and told them stories from back home. They celebrated holidays and important events by cooking traditional dishes. Parents built swings, seesaws, and sandboxes in the tiny yards behind the apartments. There, mothers could watch their children to make sure they were safe. The streets of the Lower East Side, although crowded with people, became playgrounds for the immigrant children. The East River, which flowed past the immigrant neighborhoods of the Lower East Side, was a popular spot for swimming during New York's hot summers. However, the water was extremely dirty and often caused disease. Life for immigrants was usually difficult. Some of them struggled to change the conditions in which they and other immigrants lived. One of the most famous of these people was a man named Jacob Riis. Riis came to New York in 1870 when he was 21 years old. He was shocked to see the conditions in which immigrant children lived. Riis found work as a reporter. He took pictures of poor immigrants. His photographs moved many wealthy New Yorkers to help. In 1900, partly in response to Riis's work, New York City formed the Tenement House Commission. This group worked on plans to build comfortable, safe, and more healthy apartments. Then, in 1901, the New York State Legislature passed a law to improve apartments. Apartments were made to have better fire safety features and air shafts for more fresh air and sunlight. Indoor plumbing was also improved. The law helped stop the spread of disease. It improved the lives of New York's immigrant families. The law had good effects. People made sure its rules were followed in most neighborhoods. Most of the old buildings were improved. The new ones that were built followed the law. Still, there were too many people living in too little space. This caused problems that the law could not solve. The alleys and yards around apartment buildings were often neglected. They overflowed with garbage and dirty water. This led to the spread of diseases such as cholera, typhoid, and tuberculosis. Many of the children who played in the backyards and alleys became sick. Lillian Wald decided to do something about this. Wald was a nurse. She visited sick people in their homes on the Lower East Side. Wald believed that if she lived there herself, she could learn how to help the community. In 1893, she opened a settlement house, or a home that reaches out to help a neighborhood, on Rivington Street. There, she and other nurses worked to improve living conditions. Then, in 1895, Wald got some of her friends to buy a large house on Henry Street. It became known as the Henry Street Settlement House. Wald reached out to parts of the city beyond the Lower East Side. She used money from the settlement house to hire New York City's first public school nurse. The city's Board of Education liked this idea. Nurses were hired in more schools. By 1902, 3 more buildings were added to the settlement house, all on Henry Street. One of these had a gymnasium where young people could play sports. The settlement house also provided educational and cultural activities. It offered dancing lessons and held dance parties. Its pottery and painting classes gave young Lower East Siders a chance to develop their artistic talents. That same year, Wald and the other workers opened a playground where young children could come and play. But Wald wanted to provide the children of the Lower East Side with more than just a playground. She knew that city children needed fresh air and room to run. In 1909, Wald opened 2 summer camps in the country for New York's immigrant children. The one for boys was called Camp Henry. The one for girls was called Echo Hill Farm. Then, in 1915, 2 sisters, Alice and Irene Lewison, opened the neighborhood playhouse for the Henry Street settlement. The theater performed plays that highlighted the culture of the Lower East Side. Today, the neighborhood playhouse is known as the Harry DeJure Playhouse. It still puts on plays sponsored by the Henry Street settlement. These plays continue to reflect the culture of the surrounding community. The mission of the Henry Street Settlement House continues. Workers there help homeless people find housing. They help parents find jobs, as well as daycare services for their children. A Center for the Arts gives classes and holds music, dance, and art festivals. And just like Lillian Wald, the people who work at the Henry Street Settlement House today make their own homes in the community they serve. No one advised Lillian Wald and the Lewison sisters to improve the lives of New York's immigrants. They helped people simply because they thought it was the right thing to do. However, they couldn't run the neighborhood playhouse and Henry Street Settlement by themselves. They needed the help of the people who lived in the neighborhood. The Henry Street Settlement House and Harry DeJure Playhouse survive today because the people they were set up to help have played a major role in keeping them running. Glossary. Advice. Noun. Opinion about what should be done. Suggestion. Advised. Verb. Gave advice to. Circumstances. Noun. Conditions that accompany an act or event. Elbow. Verb. To push with the elbows. Make your way by pushing. Hustled. Verb. Gotten or sold in a hurried manner. Immigrants. Noun. People who come into a country or region to live there. Luxury. Noun. Use of the best and most costly food, clothes, houses, furniture, and amusements. Newcomer. Noun. Someone who has just come, or came not long ago. Peddler. Noun. Someone who travels about selling things. Reader response. 1. The workers at the Henry Street Settlement House did things that changed the lives of the people on the Lower East Side. Use a graphic organizer like the one below to list what they did and the effects they had. 2. Summarize what the law of 1901 ordered and the effect it had. 3. Which two of the vocabulary words that are nouns are synonyms? Use a dictionary to find the meaning of the word synonym if you need to. Try to use both vocabulary words in one sentence. 4. Which of the photographs from this book best helped you understand what life was like for immigrants? Choose a photo and write about the things in it that helped your understanding.